Thank you, Brent. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know from feedback that we've received through the department already, the China-Australia Summit this week has been very successful, and I think today gives us an opportunity to build on that success with the Research Symposium and also the Investment Forum, which is taking place in Sydney today as well. So I think it's a really good set of events, and I think hopefully today we'll get some ideas about how research and policy can add to the equation for tourism as well. I'll just note at the outset, it's been a pretty big week for Tourism Research Australia. On Monday, we released our latest version of our International Visitor Survey, again showing very strong growth for international visitor arrivals, particularly from China. So another pleasing result. We've also released on Wednesday, the Minister released the Tourism Research Australia investment report for tourism. So that was an interesting one, along with the China snapshot that we did for the summit as well. We've also released our Facts and Figures booklet, which is just a little summation of some of the key data for tourism in Australia. So I think that's available at the registration desk if people like it. And today, we'll also be releasing the state tourism satellite accounts. So this is work that we've done in collaboration with the states and territories and also universities to produce a consistent set of satellite accounts for tourism across all states and territories. Next week, we'll also publish some work relating to the impact of exchange rates on tourism in Australia. And we've done this work in collaboration with our sister agency, Tourism Australia. And so that'll be another interesting sort of commentary about how exchange rates and some of the current economic conditions are confronting tourism. That gives a little bit of a mud map of where I'd like to go today. And it's really about trying to give a little bit of a context to the Australian tourism industry, looking at some of the challenges and opportunities that we're confronting at the moment, and then really trying to look at how policy and research can come together to draw out the challenges but also take advantages of the opportunities and reposition the Australian tourism industry. My colleague from Tourism Research Australia, Tim Quinn, will also be speaking this afternoon, specifically looking at repeat and first-time visitation from China to Australia. So that'll just build on some of the comments that I might have this morning. Recently, I had the fortunate opportunity to speak to a group of students and faculty at the University of Queensland. And one of the questions I actually put to the students is, why would the Australian government be interested in tourism? There are many things that the government can get involved in. There are many priorities and decisions that government have to make. But why would they be so interested in tourism? Well, we can see there's a collection of numbers there, but I think really it comes down, for my part, it comes down to the economic importance of tourism in the Australian economy. It's the economic power that it has, it's the capability of tourism to generate wealth for the Australian community, as it does for many other countries around the world, but also disperse that wealth widely through the community. 46% of all tourism expenditure in Australia occurs in regional Australia. So that offers opportunities for regional communities to diversify their economic base and build some resilience in their communities. But one thing about tourism, it's a very interesting industry in a lot of ways, but it's also very challenging as a researcher or an analyst or a government policymaker, because it does have so many different threads involved in it. It's an amorphous industry, and because of its very nature, I think it's very hard to understand, from a policymaker's point of view, very hard to understand the full set of economic linkages that tourism has through communities. And I think we see this particularly in regional communities where making investment decisions for tourism aren't necessarily compared similarly to other investment decisions that local communities might like to take. But another key characteristic really about tourism is it's shown a fair degree of resilience over a considerable period of time. Tourism, as we all know, is subject to a range of economic and non-economic shocks. These range from terrorism to health issues to transport issues, and they can even be positive. You'll notice the nice little spike there in visitor arrivals during the Sydney Olympics. So the tourism industry is subject to a lot of external factors. There are certain things that are in the control of the tourism industry itself, but there are a lot of factors that are outside what they can directly control. And that leads us into a discussion that I'll get to a little bit later about how policy can play a role in trying to help build the resilience, build that flexibility to cope with the challenges and take advantages of the opportunities going forward. The state of the industry. In November last year, Tourism Research Australia released the inaugural State of the Industry report for tourism. We did that with the Tourism Directions Conference last November. And what that was meant to do is really give quite a rigorous and robust assessment of the current state of the tourism industry. So wrapping up all of the current data, looking at the position of the Australian economy, looking at the position of the tourism industry within that. I think some of the key things that you're coming out of that is that we know that tourism's share of Australia's gross domestic product has declined over time. We know that there's been flat or falling domestic tourism demand in Australia. We know our visitor arrivals internationally have been growing more slowly. We know that there's been increased competition, not only internationally but domestically. And that's not just for the tourist dollar, but it's also how the tourist dollar competes against other household consumption expenditure. There are a wide set of things that people can spend money on. Whether they engage in a domestic holiday experience is only one of the choices they face. Coupled with that, we've had a large increase in outbound tourism. Now, this has been supported by strong income growth in Australia, air access arrangements, but also the opening of other destinations and really the accessibility of those destinations. So there are a range of issues and challenges that the industry is facing. However, there are also a range of opportunities that are presented to the tourism industry. We've had a global financial crisis. Out of that, we've seen much slower economic growth coming out of traditional markets for North America and Europe. But we've seen Asia rebound much more strongly in an economic sense. So Asia is going to continue to grow. We've seen that reflected in our visitation from Asia and in particular China. But policy has got to adapt. It's got to help foster that change for the industry. It's got to help pick up where the growth opportunities are and build that resilience and flexibility. Key amongst it, of course, will be trying to remain competitive. It's not only that we've got to compete against other tourism destinations, as I said, we've also got to compete for that share of household consumption expenditure. Over recent times, we've seen Australia's outbound tourism grow to such an extent that our contribution to global tourist arrivals has actually increased. For a country of 22 million people, it's a salutary reminder that Australians are now looking outbound more than they ever have in the past. We've also seen a transition for the Australian tourism industry from a tourism trade-related surplus to a tourism deficit. And it's always very difficult from a macroeconomic point of view to do that type of analysis on a sector-by-sector basis. But it does demonstrate that there has been probably much faster growth in outbound tourism in comparison to inbound tourism and domestic tourism. So it's just one of the challenges that the industry has got to pick up its level of competitiveness so that it can compete in that sort of economic environment. The other form of competition the industry faces is really structural within the Australian economy. We've had a resources sector that's been growing very rapidly. We're going to see some structural changes in the Australian economy as a result of the resource sector growth. Resources industry has driven not only income growth in Australia, but also exchange rate effects on the Australian economy. So the tourism industry is going to have to compete on a range of levels. We know that tourism is traditionally a labour-intensive industry. And this is part of the great intersection we have in the Australian economy now between the tourism industry and other sectors of the economy in comparison to sectors such as the resources industry. The resources industry is absorbing more labour over recent times, and it's forecast to absorb even more labour over the near term. The National Resource Sector Employment Task Force is expecting mining sector employment to grow at about 5% a year over the next 5 years. To compare and contrast, the Australian economy over the past 5 years, the labour force has grown at 2.3% and the tourism labour force has grown at 1.3%. So tourism is going to confront a situation of a long-lived competition for labour resources. That's going to focus attention on productivity within the sector. It's going to focus attention on how we get investment dollars to help raise that productivity level. This is, I think, a very interesting chart and just underlies the level of competition that the industry faces from within the structural change for the Australian economy. 2011-12, it is forecast that investment in the mining sector in Australia will exceed total investment in all other sectors of the Australian economy. So there are going to be resource constraints just attracting capital for the tourism industry, as there are for other industries. Talking to our colleagues in the Commonwealth Treasury, this has been driven by the mining boom, but when you look at the resource base of Australia, some of the base commodities that we have to export, the longevity of the potential supply of those commodities and the level of industrialisation and urbanisation that can still occur in Asia is going to potentially mean that we have a very long-lived resources boom.